Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about another comparison and contrast. Last time we talked about science fiction versus science fantasy, and today what I want to talk about is a couple of more fantasy genres. One is high fantasy, or sometimes called epic fantasy. And another one is called sword and sorcery, or sometimes called heroic fantasy. I'm probably use those terms kind of interchangeably. That's why I want to get into them. Um, and I think these kind of fall into like of all of the different subgenres of fantasy. I think most of them fall into one of these two categories. Probably the one that I think most viewers are going to be familiar with is more the high fantasy or the epic fantasy sort of thing. Mainly because right now it seems to be that's the most popular. Um, and but it's not necessarily the oldest, but it is definitely the most popular. I see lots and lots of stories that are kind of fall more into the sort of epic high fantasy version than I do sword and sorcery. Um, so let's kind of break the two down. High fantasy. High fantasy is usually called high fantasy because it probably I think the best way to think about it is it most closely resembles Dungeons and Dragons. uh, fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons as they exist. So what you have is usually multiple characters, sometimes working together in teams or sometimes kind of independently, and just like different chapters and stuff are told from their viewpoints. But lots of different characters. Different races tend to be very common. So think of like Lord of the Rings is probably a good example, probably the prototypical example of high fantasy. So you've got hobbits, you got elves, you got dwarves, you got humans, you've got different kinds of humans. They're fighting against orcs and goblins and trolls. Lots of monsters as well, to the point that the monsters they're kind of scary to the characters, but they're not strange and bizarre. Like the notion that orcs exist doesn't cause anyone any disturbances, for instance. They just, well, yeah, orcs exist, they're bad, we all know that they're bad. And they're scary mainly because we're seeing most of the story through like the sort of the point of view of like Frodo and Samwise, who don't know about orcs, they can't fight orcs, it's all very scary from their perspective. But Aragorn and Gimli, they just kind of think of it as like something new to fight. And that kind of brings another thing with the high fantasy is magic is way more common, and it tends to be a lot more flashy. You'll see wizards casting fireballs or lightning or something else like that. There's notions of like dragons, very powerful monsters. Maybe there's not very many of them, but they exist. They're known to exist. That sort of thing. So like I said, it kind of feels like a Dungeons and Dragons game where your first level fighter isn't that perturbed that there are orcs in the world. There's something to fight, and they might actually kill them because you're just a first level fighter, but nobody's like, oh my god, where are these monsters coming out of the woods or anything. Um, with high fantasy, the scope tends to be very large as well. That's why it's called epic, I think, because it not only takes place across multiple characters, but might take place across different countries, different continents, maybe even different dimensions, other worlds. There may be, intergalactic, international hopping going on, and so it's very epic in scope, and it might be going over different even generations and that sort of thing. And so epic fantasy or high fantasy is just that. It's epic. It's big. It's very almost biblical. I mean, that's what the Silmarillion. This is that's what Silmarillion is basically Tolkien's Bible of his world and how it worked and how the different ages played out and who Sauron is and all these other things and so it's really huge, and it can give you a lot to really sink your teeth into. Sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy is almost the exact opposite in almost every way. One, it's usually called heroic fantasy because it's about a hero. one person, maybe two. If you read like the Lankmar series, the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, that's of course two people. But for the most part, when I think of sword and sorcery, I'm thinking things like Conan the Barbarian, where there's just one character and he just kind of appears in all the stories. And there'll be little ancillary characters, but they may show up in a story and then never come back again, never be discussed again. And because of that one hero sort of story, everything else becomes very personal. It becomes very small. The stories may only happen in, one town, or like think about Rogues in the House, one of the Conan stories. Most of it happens as they're breaking into this wizard's manor. Tower of the Elephant, same sort of thing. It also feels like a D&D game in the sense that it's like an adventure, but it's like an adventure. Whereas with high fantasy, it's like a whole campaign. Kind of think of it in those terms. And so because that, it's very personal, it's very small, it's very short in scope. It is just like one adventure. The Tower of the Elephant basically all takes course over a single night of this. So whereas in Lord of the Rings, the whole story is just one long, years long. I forget how many years it's supposed to be. And of course, there's a difference. Rogues in the House is a short story, whereas this is a series of novels. But that's the other thing, is like you can tell really good heroic fantasy, really good sword and sorcery stories as a short story. In fact, I think they're better as short stories. I think if you try to drag out a novel length sword and sorcery, it might get a little dull. But I don't know. I kind of want to try it myself. Also, in most sword and sorcery, pretty much there are only humans. Monsters or other races, as we think about them in like role-playing terms, they either don't exist or they're very rare. They're very weird. Like, again, using Rogues in the House as an example, Conan comes across Thrak. Now, it tells us kind of the backstory that Thrak is a part of this race of 8 men that are sort of cunning and smart, and the wizard captured one of them and he kind of trained him, and Thrak then got smart enough that he could figure out how to work the wizard's traps as well, and so Conan had to fight against him and barely won, and so we know that they're kind of a race, but we've only seen one, and Conan has never seen one of these before ever. If it has any weaknesses, no one knows about it. Like in The Hobbit, it's sort of known that, well, trolls, if they are exposed to sunlight, they'll turn into stone. I think goblins have that same problem. Whereas in sword and sorcery, you would have to figure that out. In fact, that would probably be sort of the plot point of the story, is this thing fighting Conan for so long that it doesn't notice the sun is rising, and then it turns into stone. That's kind of the difference between these sort of things. With sword and sorcery and most heroic fantasy, if a monster exists, there may be just one of them. You may not know where it came from, how it came to be, what its weaknesses are, if it has any wants or desires beyond just killing the hero. We don't really know that because it's all very, very small. And we usually kind of tell the story from the perspective of the hero. And so we only really know what the hero knows, which in most sword and sorcery tales is not really that much. And so in my mind, it feels like I feel like I can get into a sword and sorcery story better than an epic fantasy, because I can really identify with the character, and when he's lost or confused or feeling powerless, I'm right there with him because I don't know what's going on, just like the character doesn't know. And also with sword and sorcery, that also means like the scope of the stories are a lot smaller. We're not globe hopping. We're not interdimensionally hopping. Also, a big difference between most sword and sorcery stories too is the magic. When you read like a lot of the Conan stories, the magic system is not really explained. There's not really like a magic system, if you would. And he kind of pulled a lot of that, I think, from H.P. Lovecraft, which they were pen pals for a while, and they talked a lot. And with H.P. Lovecraft, his notion of magic is that it's bizarre. It's dangerous. Only crazy people would do it. It will probably corrupt you and drive you insane. And so magic is always pretty much the purview of the villains. I don't think there's really much of a sword and sorcery story, at least a Conan story that I can think of, where the magic user was the hero, was really kind of the good guy. They were almost always villainous. And because of that, magic is used sparingly. It's also usually very subtle. Maybe in some sword and sorcery stories, wizards are casting fireballs or something else like that. But in most of them, what I've seen, they might try and perform a ritual to transform themselves into something even more powerful, or raise the dead, or raise a demon or a god or something else like that. It's usually something really big. It's not something mundane. The notion of cantrips as they exist in Dungeons and Dragons would not happen in a sword and sorcery, that someone can just kind of snap their fingers and something happens. That alone would make them really a powerful being in sword and sorcery. So from a reading perspective, what do they have to offer people? So I think most of the people who like high fantasy epic stories, I think they really like worlds. I think they like getting lost in worlds. Nothing wrong with any of this stuff, by the way. This is just what I see people like. But they seem to really like the worlds. They like reading about different races, different cultures, different magic systems. They like the scope. That's one of the things, and that's why there's so many people who really love Lord of the Rings, is there's so much to sink your teeth into, really, as far as all the notes and the Silmarillion and all that sort of stuff. And then of course his son has been putting out other books on the Lord of the Rings, and so people can really kind of get lost in that world. I know it's one of the reasons why I like Dune, which is not, it's more science fiction or more science fantasy, really, because it does have that depth to it, and it's sort of like epic sci-fi, if you will. And so I think a lot of people who are looking for a world to kind of get lost in and explore and to hear more about, and there's a lot of fan fiction in these kind of worlds and that sort of stuff, because there's a lot of room to do other things. Apparently that was one of the things that Tolkien was always kind of sad about, was that everybody got caught up with the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, and just those stories and just those characters. In his mind, those were just like a small section of a much bigger world. And if you read the Silmarillion, which I'm kind of familiar with what's in there, then yeah, you can see he had room for lots of different stories, lots of different directions for people to go with, for him to have gone with, because there's just so much there. The flip side is because of that, a lot of times the characters, in my mind, just always feels a little thin. You can have Aragorn's kind of a badass, and a lot of people like Legolas and that sort of thing. I was more of a Gimli fan myself. But because you have to hit all these different things, I think it takes a pretty good writer to really give enough character, enough depth to where you feel like you can kind of really get into it. Now, I think Tolkien, did that because he's Tolkien. He's a really great writer. But other epic fantasy doesn't always seem to do that. Even some of the really good ones, I'll talk about one of those in a little bit. With heroic fantasy, I think it's just kind of the opposite. What people like is they like the hero, and they want to see that hero in another. We'll wait for the fire engine. Oh wait, that's an ambulance. There we go. And by the way, this is my office, so imagine trying to run, counseling sessions with, anyway. But anyway, I digress. With heroic fantasy, with sword and sorcery, people, I think, really like the character, and what they want to do is see that character in different adventures. They want to see them in getting in trouble, and how is that character going to get out of it. Like Conan the Barbarian, he's all about fighting. He's really much more about just being really tough. I think that's more of his. If he had a superpower, that's what his toughness is he's just really tough, really resilient, doesn't give up. He's tough in mind, tough in body, and whatever's happening, he's just going to keep going. He's going to go down fighting if he has to, and people really like that. If you read sort of like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, they have their own ways of dealing with troubles and stuff. And so, and this sort of thing carries over into Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, the Lone Ranger, the Shadow, the Phantom. It's all of these. It's a character, and people like that character, and they want to see them go through different adventures or solve mysteries or whatever else and that sort of thing. The worlds tend to be a lot smaller. Sometimes all we really know is what that character would know about the world. Sometimes they'll give a little bit more of a background. Like if you read a lot of the Conan stories, Robert E. Howard will kind of digress and tell you a little bit about the history of what's about that place or what's going on or what these monsters are. He's just giving you little hints of the world, just enough for that way give you some context of what's going on in the story. Not that Conan knows any of this stuff, but you, the reader, can appreciate what's going on a little bit better because you have the background. And then sometimes he just doesn't really explain it at all. He'll just throw out a name like Hyrcanians, and if you read enough of his stories, you kind of realize Hyrcanians they're archers and they ride horseback, and it's like, oh, okay, they're kind of like the Mongols. I get that, The Stygians are very Egyptian. They're like the ancient Egyptians, and he just does that by describing a little bit about like how they are, how they act, maybe a little bit how they look. Their names tend to give away a lot of those. Stygian characters tend to have Egyptian names. But he doesn't really go into too much depth. He just kind of gives you a little hint, just a little flavor, just an idea of what this world is about, and it's up to you to fill in the details. In fact, a lot of the details of the Hyborian world has been, kind of filled in by other people. He did write an essay on this thing called The Age of Hyboria. And I think, if I remember right, Weird Tales asked him to write that, so that way he would have this sort of framework of the whole world and its history and that sort of stuff. But that was kind of written after the fact. That was after Conan got really popular that he finally decided to sit down and write that. And a lot of that I think he already had ideas for, because before Conan was Kull the Conqueror. And Kull the Conqueror was an Atlantean. And so I think when he got tired of writing Kull, for some reason, he decided just to advance the world timeline by 10,000 years and invented Conan and kind of wrote from that. So that is, I think that sometimes the complaint that fans of epic fantasy have over Sword and Sorcery is it doesn't feel big, and that's because it's not. You don't read Conan to get the same level of world building and fantasy as you do, Lord of the Rings, because they're just totally different kind of genres. As far as writing goes, I think that it appeals to different writers for the same reasons. I don't really like the idea of writing epic fantasy. I'm not that interested in world building. Back when I was playing a lot more Dungeons and Dragons and I was running games and I was inventing my own worlds, that was kind of interesting to a point. I pretty much always did the thing where I created just enough of a world to what I needed for the campaign. I wasn't interested in writing 5,000 years of history of the world. I wasn't interested in writing the mythology or what the seasonal holidays are in this one little region or anything. That has never been my bag. It's not something I'm really that interested in. I like to have sort of like a theme running in the back of my mind and just kind of building off of that. As long as what I'm writing fits in the theme that I'm writing, then that's good enough for me. I also like to just sort of throw out little hints to the reader as far as the world and what's going on and that sort of stuff. No one story really tells you everything that happens in the world. If you read all the stories, kind of like what Robert E. Howard did, you read all the stories, you can start to piece together what the world probably looks like and what the people look like in it and that sort of thing. I think from a writer's perspective, the nice thing about Sword and Sorcery is it prevents the notion of information dump. I know that's one of the problems that some epic fantasy writers write and some science fiction writers is They have created this really intricate world with all this stuff and all these people and all this history, and they want you to know about it. And they will write 5 pages, a whole chapter on just that one thing. And to be honest, this is something that Tolkien is guilty of, and that's one of the reasons why it's kind of hard to get into it. Once you get past a certain point and you get in the story, it gets really good. But I believe like the first chapter or two is just like hobbits. What do they like to eat and where they like to live and their history and all this other stuff. And unless you're really into it, I don't care, and so that's one of the problems with Sword and Sorcery, because there isn't a really in-depth world. The author hasn't spent months or years crafting this perfect world. There's no real information dump. For me, an information dump is like maybe a paragraph or two. Again, I try and do like what Howard does, is I'm just going to give you enough information to give you some context for this one story, and then we'll be done. And it may never come up again, another story. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. And so I think that is a really good one. And the examples of these two is what I've been using throughout this whole video is for epic fantasy. Look to something like Lord of the Rings. I believe a lot of Brandon Sanderson's work is also very epic fantasy. There's a few others. Actually, there's a lot of others. I just don't read it, so I'm not as familiar with it. Sword and Sorcery, probably the classic examples is the Conan stories by Robert E. Howard. In general, he's thought of as like the father of Sword and Sorcery. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, the Fritz Leiber stories. He is actually one who kind of coined the phrase Sword and Sorcery. So those are also good as well. I think part of what happened is back in the 70s, a lot of the Conan stories came back into vogue. I'm not really sure what happened. I'm probably going to do a whole video on Robert E. Howard, so I'll talk more about that later. But those became back in vogue again. They came back into publication. Frank Frazetta did the covers. They're amazing covers. People started doing more pastiches. They started writing more of their own stories. Robert Jordan wrote a lot of the Conan stories from the 70s and the 80s. Marvel Comics picked up Conan, started making their own Conan comics. For a while, Conan was more popular than Spider-Man. And then, of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger came along. We got the movie. That kickstarted a whole bunch of other movies. And so there's a bunch of Sword and Sorcery stuff that kind of came out in the 70s and 80s. And somewhere along the line in the late 80s, it just kind of got stupid and people just stopped making it. I think it's starting to get a resurgence now. Maybe it's just me because I'm biased because I like this and this is just some of the stories I write. But there's some newer authors. They're putting out some Sword and Sorcery stuff again. And I want to talk a little bit more about that later. I think an interesting one is George R.R. Martin, Song of Ice and Fire. That feels like he did a pretty good job, for the most part, of combining the two. Song of Ice and Fire is definitely epic. It has a long history. It has a multitude of characters. It takes place over the whole Isle of Westeros, and then it crosses over into the other islands where like Daenerys is. And so it's very broad in scope geographically. The story takes place over the course of, a year or something, because seasons work weird in the story. That's hard to know how long it takes, but it's definitely been a while since the beginning of the story to the end of book 5. And then again, and also there's magic in the world, but it's weird. It's ancient. Like there's evidence of magic, like the wall. They're pretty sure that one came from magic. Dragons get reintroduced, but magic is sort of still subtle and weird and strange, and not a lot of people do it. There's monsters, but they frighten people. Well, there's not too many monsters. You've got like mainly the walkers from the White Walkers in the north. I think that might be it. I can't really think of any other monsters. Most of the monsters in George R. R. Martin's stories are other people, which again fits very much in Sword and Sorcery. But he does a really good job of, like, even though it's a whole cast of characters, each character gets its own chapter. And he really gets in depth in that character. And so you really feel like you know them. You only get to see the story from that character's perspective, which is kind of interesting because a character might be thinking or acting in a way that we know is wrong because we just read this other chapter and we know what's really going on, but they don't know that. And so I think his story is really good in that sense. So I think, that's probably one of the reasons why his stories are so popular, is because there's a nice blend of epic fantasy and sword and sorcery. And so if you like one, you've got another reason to do it. It'd just be nice for you to, like, finish the fucking series. But anyway, to the point I'm like, I'm kind of even giving up. But anyway, that's sort of my thoughts on, high fantasy and sword and sorcery. Clearly my favorite is sword and sorcery. Like, I could probably make a whole video on just that one topic, and I might someday. But I'd like to know what's y'all's favorite. Which do you like better? Do you have a preference? Do you read both? How do you juggle the two? If you'd like to see sort of my version of Sword and Sorcery, in the links below there will be a copy of a book, The Adventures of Yark the Scholar. Right now it's free. I'm probably going to eventually change that, but I'm writing more short stories and I'll be putting that out there. So if you want a little taste of my version of Sword and Sorcery for free, then just check out the link below for The Adventures of Yark the Scholar. Anyway, I will talk to you later. Bye.